Shalom Aleichem. Shalom Aleichem. Good morning, everybody. This is Rabbi Sayani, coming to you on this cold March day. Um, and the topic of what we're going to talk about today is a term that I think a lot of us have heard, but we'll explore some of the reasonings for it. Shmurah Matzah. What exactly does that mean? When is it required? Why is it required? Is it required? Um, and Before I begin the shir, um, it should be for refuah shlema for all of the Choli Yisrael, especially those in our Shuli Delay Bas Freidel, and for Reza Bas Malka, and for Gabriela Bas Sorimeno, for everybody who is in need of refuah shlema, a healing of mind, body, soul, spirit, and also Lulei Nishmas Shlomo ben Aaron Vachana, our friend Simon Miller, Oliver Shalom, who was nifter. I think just about Shloshim, just about 30 days ago. And also should be in the schus of safety for the Bnei Eretz Yisrael. We're at war now, and there's no way really around that, no way to cut and dice it. That we are at war right now, as we face this conflict with Iran. Also in our own country. I hate to put it this way, but we are at war in our own country against the forces that do hate us. Um, and so, as I heard a shiur, I was listening to a shiur from very, very dear Rav Aaron Rothkopf for Kefed in Eretz Yisrael. He begins his shiur as follows, and I'll do the same. Achenu kol beit Yisrael chanatuni b'tzaro v'shiv yachom din bein bayam uvein bayabasha. As for our brothers and sisters, the whole house of Israel who are given over to trouble or captivity, whether they abide on the sea or on the dry land. Hamakom yirachem aleichem v'yotzi mitzara dervacha miyafelu le'oro mishibod v'gula hashtabad lavisman kariv v'noimar amen. May God have mercy upon them and bring them forth from trouble to relief, from darkness to light, and from subjugation to redemption, now speedily and at a near time, and let us say amen. Um, Another point that I'd like to make, Pesach is very, very close upon us. It's Rosh Chodesh Nisan tomorrow night. I'm sorry, tonight is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Tonight and tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And um, it is a time of great renewal. It is actually one of the four New Years on the calendar. So I want to have the kavanah. I want everybody to have the intention that this is a new beginning, that um, whatever it is in your life that is holding you back, whatever is enslaving you, whatever is hindering you, this is a good opportunity. It's an auspicious time. It's an eight ratzon to give that up, to surrender it to God. Um, Another interesting thing about um, the month of Nisan, of course, is that we don't say Tachnun for the entire month. Tachnun is the penitential prayer that we say Shachrit and Mincha for the morning and afternoon prayers of weekdays, with the exception of weekdays that are of a festive or quasi-festive nature. Um, the So for the month of Nisan, there is no Tachnun said. We don't come back to this prayer until Iyar. Um, and one of the sections of Tachnun, somewhat of a later addition to Tachnun, is the prayer Shomer Yisrael. And it is very appropriate given these circumstances that we're in right now. Shem Yisrael, Shemor Shor Yisrael, V'Yovad Yisrael, Chomrim Shema Yisrael. Guardian of Israel, guard the remnant of Israel, and let not Israel perish, who say, Hero Israel. Shomer Goy Echad, Shemor Shor Ram Echad, V'El Yovad Goy Echad, Ham Yachadim, Shimcha Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Guardian of the unique nation, guard the remnant of the unique people, and let not the unique nation perish, who proclaim the oneness of your name, saying, Hashem is our God, Hashem is one. Shomer Goy Kadosh, Shemor Shor Ram Kadosh, V'El Yovad Goy Kadosh, Mishalshim b'shalosh kedushot lekadosh. Guardian of the holy nation, guard the remnant of the holy people, and let not the holy nation perish. Who repeat the kedusha, the threefold sanctification to the Holy One. Yitratzeh barachamim u'mitpayis b'tachanunim, yitratzeh v'hitpayis l'dorani ki ein ozer. Avinu malkeinu chanenu v'enenu ki ein banu masim aseh lanu tzedakah v'chesed v'hoshienu. You who are appeased by pleas for mercy and conciliated by supplications, be appeased and conciliated to inflict a generation, for there is none else to help. Our Father, our King, be gracious to us and answer us, for we have no good deeds. Deal with us charitably and kindly and deliver us. So we're going to talk about Shmurah Matzah, which I think a lot of us just understand that, at the Seder, we have, this wonderfully rustic-looking round matzah, often charred, and unfortunately, given the economic situation, very expensive this year. There's hand Shmurah Matzah, machine Shmurah Matzah. We'll explain the differences between those. Hand Shmurah Matzah, the round one that we're familiar with, I've seen 2-pound boxes go for as much as $100 this year. It is a labor of love. And certainly the price reflects all of the various elements that go into it. Just like kosher meat has so many elements that go into it, and that's why it's so expensive. And interestingly, the discussion of Shmurah Matzah begins with a discussion about the Gittin, the Samaritans. So in Masechet Chullin, Daf Gimel ibid, there's a discussion. So in that first parak of Masechet Chullin, there is just a full discussion about, it's called Hakol Shochtim. It's about who is really valid to slaughter kosher meat, who could be a shochet. And there's a discussion about whether we would accept the chita of a kuti of a Samaritan. Now, for anybody who understands or knows something about the history of that period, Jews and Samaritans didn't have the best of relationship, and that is reflected in these discussions in the Gemara about what is their status, what do we accept, what do we accept, as valid from the Samaritans. Samaritans are a group that actually still exists. They're a very small group. They were banned from the Jewish people at the time of Ezra, actually. Right, Ezra led the Jewish people when came back from exile from the period of the first temple's destruction. And they were people who populated the area of the Shomron, of Samaria, by Sennacherib, and they kind of believe in the 5 books, but not quite the same way we do. They really reject the rest of Tanakh. They hold Mount Gerizim to be a very holy place. Um, they keep some commandments of the Torah, not the way we do, but they keep some commandments of the Torah. Um, they were active in trying to keep the returnees, the Jews who returned from rebuilding the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. So, there was enmity between them. Yochanan Hyrcanus led his troops into battle against the Samaritans and destroyed the temple that they built on Mount Gerizim. So the point is that they were kind of idolatrous, but also somewhat Jewish, and they still exist. Actually, they're a very small community with Samaritans. Um, Very interesting group. But the question is, do we accept the shechit of a Samaritan? That leads into a discussion of whether we accept the matzah of a Samaritan. So the Gemara in Masechet Chullin Daf Gimel and Beit teaches Tana Rabban Shechita Kuti Matarek Bami Devarim Memorim. So the sages taught in a brisa is the slaughter performed by a Samaritan is it permitted outright? And in what case is the statement said? Kashay Yisrael Omer al Gabav Aval Ba Umitzo Shishachat Chota Chazayid Venoten Lo Achlo Mutter Leachol Mishechit Mishechitato Im Lav Asur Leachol Mishechitato. So the case of where the shechita of a Samaritan is accepted is where a Jew is standing over him and supervising to ensure that the slaughter was done properly. If a Jew came and found that the Kuti already slaughtered the animal, he would cut an olive bulk, a kazayit, of meat from the slaughtered animal, give it to the Samaritan to eat. If the Samaritan would eat it, then it's permitted for the Jew to eat meat from what the Samaritan slaughtered. If the Samaritan would not eat the meat, then it would be prohibited to eat from what he slaughtered, because if he doesn't eat from it, then it's clear that the Samaritan doesn't accept it. Similarly, if the Jew found in the possession of a Samaritan, the Korea shows the Purim Kotei Rosh Shalechad Mechem Venoten Lo Achalo Mutar Lechol Meshichitato Ve'im Lav Asur Lechol Meshichitato. So if we find in the possession of a Samaritan a string, or the Korea, a string of birds, and the Jew doesn't know whether they were shechted, whether they were properly slaughtered, he would sever the head of one of them and give it to the Samaritan to eat. If the Samaritan ate it, it's permitted for the Jew to eat the meat from what the Samaritan slaughtered. But if the Samaritan did not eat the meat, then it's prohibited to eat from what he slaughtered. So we have to have some kind of safeguard, because we, question. We're obviously questioning, their commitment, even though the Samaritan would never eat non-kosher meat himself, but he might come to feed it to other Jews. Why? And Rashi may explain this. So they don't have a concept of lifnei iver lo titen mitchal, that you're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of somebody, that you're not allowed to cause other people to do sins. So when the Torah says not to put a stumbling block in front of the blind, the Samaritans believe that literally, because they didn't believe in oral Torah. They didn't have the drush of Chazal that this really means that you can't cause other Jews to sin, that you can't cause them to perform an avera. So if he himself would eat it, Right? Matzah sheshachti chotek kazayt v'notin la'achol mutar l'chol mishichato v'im lav asur l'chol mishichato. If he would eat it himself, you could trust him. If not, not. Kayot sebo. Similarly, by the string of birds, right? So, Bai and Rava, they're interpreting the first few words of the Mishnah. So they had a machloket about a dispute over what kind of supervision we need by a Samaritan to perform his shechita. Bai says you require a higher standard of gadol omer al gabav, where you need a Jew watching over him. And according to Rava, it's enough even with what we would say is yotzei v'nichnas, sort of an intermittent supervision. He comes and goes. Um, right, yotzei v'nichnas is actually how kosher supervision operates in many ways, right? So depending on what the item is, the supervision is yotzei v'nichnas, not by matzah. Anything that's very sensitive, matzah, meat, cheese, grape juice, wine, you're going to have full-time supervision. Fish, according to certain opinions as well. Um, Obviously, yotzei v'nichnas is what Dunkin' Donuts is relying on Union Turnpike. It's what ice cream stores are relying on. It's what Ritz crackers and Chips Ahoy and Coca-Cola and Tuscan milk and whatever other things in America have an OU or a Chaf K or an OK. They rely on yotzei v'nichnas, intermittent supervision. A little bit of a lesser standard, but it's considered the supervision that would be valid according to Rava. According to Abaya, though, the Kuti he requires a higher standard. So Abaya diek Naresha, Rava diek Masefa. Each bring a proof. The Medayik each bring a proof to their position. Abaya from the Reish of the Baraita, and from the beginning, Rava from the Seifa, from the conclusion there. Abaya diek Naresha, Tama di Israel Amir al Gabav. So we can only accept a Samaritan's shechita when the Jew is supervising him. Well, yotzei v'nichnas lo. So what could we infer from the fact that the Breita says it's only if there's a Jew who's actually standing over him that the shechita is good? That implies that if he would just be coming and going, like most hashgachot today, that wouldn't be good enough. Rava diek Seifa. Rava says no. So the Seifa says that only like we would have a problem when we have like this first taste test. So you have to give it to the Kuti to see if he'll eat it himself, and if he will eat it, then we could trust him. If not, we can't trust him. So Rava says it's only if you came and you found it without any supervision, maybe implying that if there would be yotzei v'nichnas, it would be fine. Um, Now, what about other mitzvot like matzah? Um, the Gemara says, "V'achzuk v'la'achzuk b'daketiva tanaihi tetanya matzat kuti mutared v'adam yotzei b'yidei chovato b'Pesach." So, with regard to mitzvot that are not written explicitly in the Torah that the Samaritans embraced, the question of whether they're presumed to fulfill them in the manner that Jews fulfill them, or they are not presumed to do so, it's a dispute between Tanaim, as it's taught in the Brisa that it's permitted to eat the matzah of a Samaritan on Pesach, and a person could fulfill his obligation to eat matzah at the Seder with it. So the text really says the first night of Pesach, but for us outside of Israel, we have 2 days. So it's the obligation to eat matzah for Shana Pesach at the Seder. Rabbi Elazar Oser lefi she'ein bekiin b'didutei b'tzvot ki Yisrael. Rabbi Elazar prohibits consuming the matzah of a Samaritan in Pesach because the Samaritans are not experts in the details of mitzvot like Jews, and they don't know the precise nature of chametz that's prohibited by the Torah. Right? They don't believe in oral law, so how can they properly make matzah? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel kol mitzvah shechaziku bakutim harbe medaktim bayoter mi-Yisrael. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, on the contrary, with regard to any mitzvah that the Samaritans embraced and accepted upon themselves, they're more exacting in its observance than the Jews are. Therefore, one may assume that they prepared the matzah properly. So it's an interesting claim, because in certain ways, it's really out of ignorance because they don't believe in the oral law. But you have groups nowadays like the Karaites who don't believe in oral Torah, and yet, they'll claim that rice could become chametz in Pesach. Um, or they'll claim, that you can't have the lights left on over Shabbat. Right? We hold that you can't turn it on and off, but you could certainly leave it on. They would sit in the dark on Shabbat and eat cold food. So that's the interesting claim that he makes, that these oral Torah deniers are more exacting in observance of at least chametz than Jews. So you could assume that they made the matzah properly. Amar matzah kuti mutared v'adam yotzi b'yidei chovatov Pesach peshita. Mahu detema la b'ki b'shimor kamash malan. Rabbi Elazar Oser Fishain Bekin B'Ditukte Mitzvot Kasavar La B'Ki B'Shimor. So the Gemara then goes to analyze that writer, and the master says, it's permitted to eat the matzah of a Samaritan on Pesach. A person fulfills his obligation to eat the matzah of the Seder with it. The Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that if the matzah is permitted, one could fulfill your obligation with it on Pesach? So that's a key point, and that's really what this discussion will hinge on. If matzah is just kosher for Passover, is that enough to fulfill the mitzvah of the Seder? And the Gemara answers, lest you say that Samaritans are not expert in the mitzvah regarding the matzah for the sake of matzah. The Tana teaches us that they are expert, and Rabbi Lezer deems it prohibited to eat the matzah of Samaritans in Pesach because they're not experts in the details of the mitzvot. And he holds that they're not expert in the mitzvah regarding the matzah for the sake of the mitzvah. So we'll see in a little bit that there's matzah and then there's matzah. So you could have matzah that's basically just a flatbread that's not chametz, right? That's, Streitz, Horowitz, Margaret, and Manischewitz. That's the matzah that's $4 or $5 a box. I assume it's that expensive nowadays. That's the matzah that you get free. You spend $40 in ShopRite or wherever. They give you the free matzah. It's kosher for Pesach matzah, and it's not chametz. It's absolutely, matzah. It's the bread of Pesach that we could spread butter on and have with our tea, or eat casually. But it is not the matzah that one could use to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah at the Seder. So we've established that sort of this matzah of the putim, it's not chametz, because they understand that they can't eat chametz on Pesach. Um, but they're not expert in the principle of guarding the matzah. So the rabbis learn from the verse Ushmartem et Chamatzot that you should watch over the matzot, that you have to watch over them for the purpose of the mitzvah. This is Exodus, I believe, chapter 12, verse 17. Um, that the Samaritans were not holding in. Um, and we know that for matzah to be used for the mitzvah, there is that extra obligation of watching, of guarding, which we'll explain in a bit. So Rashi, says, Peshita Diotzi Bakevim Dim Muteret, that since it's not chametz, it's matzah, but Mahu Detei Gavta Peshita Lan Delo Chanichu Lachametz, even though the Samaritan will never let it become chametz, will be permitted to eat. They're not careful in watching it and guarding it lishma for the purpose of matzah shem mitzvah. And you can't use it for the mitzvah. No different than the bread of idolaters. It's really no different than the bread made by a non-Jew that just is not chametz, which would be, you know, whatever kosher for Pesach, a roll or matzah, whatever it is. Um, so in the times of the Gemara, there used to be signs that they would do to tell if a baked item was chametz or not, because you have to understand back then, chametz bread that they ate, it wasn't like a loaf of bread like we have nowadays. The bread that they ate in the time of the Gemara, right? Just keep in mind, this is Babylon, this is Iraq, the Near East. Their chametz bread was like a laffa, it was like a pita, you know. So fully chametz, but it doesn't have doesn't have like the loaf quality that we associate with bread, in the Western world. Um, so not like a challah, let's say. So, um, if you have bread of a non-Jew that you could tell by looking at it, it's not chametz. You cannot use it for the mitzvah of matzah for the sidarim because it was not baked for the purpose of the mitzvah. So, in order to fulfill the purpose of the mitzvah of achilat matzah, of having matzah at the sidarim, you know, we make the bracha of hamotzi al achilat matzah, and that includes the matzah that we eat while reclining, and then we have korach, we have the hillel sandwich, and then we have the afikomen. All of that is what we're referring to as mitzvah matzah. So for that, not only does it have to be pesachdik, not only does it have to not be chametz, but it has to be watched over, guarded for the purpose of the mitzvah of matzah. So the dispute here is about something that is said in the Torah, but the rabbis were not sure whether the Samaritans accepted this. So, right, Tanakh Savar Kevan de Chtiva, since the mitzvah of Ushmartem et Hamatzot it is written, Afal Gavdalo Chekziku, but Namilo, even though we're not sure if they accepted it, we have to assume that they did since it's written. Rishim ben Gamliel Savri Achzuk In Ilo Achzuk Lo. It's not only if we know that they accepted it, if we don't know they accepted it, we can't necessarily trust them. So it would have to be written, and we have to know they accepted it. If that's the case, asks the Gemara, then kol mitzvah shechiksiku ba'kutim. Why does he say any mitzvah that the kutim have accepted? It should have said if they have accepted it. Israel. So this is all discussion about how committed the Samaritans were to fulfilling the mitzvot. And I think the dispute here between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who says if they accepted it, they accepted, and we can trust them in the Tanakama. I think from that, the practice would certainly follow the Tanakama. Right, Tanakama, Savak Kevan, Delo, Ktiva, Afal, Gav, Ziku, Banamilo. We hold like that there has to be an aspect of guarded matzah for the Seder. And it's not just enough that that it be produced by well-meaning people who are not really Jewish, who understand that we can't have chametz. It has to be for the sake of the mitzvah. So we see that with regard to matzah for the Siddharim, for those three mitzvahs, or of the mitzvah itself, at three times, right? We have the eating of the matzah, then we make the Hillel sandwich, and then we have the afikomen. There has to be not just matzah that's free of chametz, but it has to be guarded. There has to be an aspect of shimur guarding. The matzah itself has to be made for the sake of the mitzvah by people who are obligated in the mitzvah, who believe in the mitzvah, and made by people who are trustworthy, who are neman, shomer Shabbat. And while the Samaritan may be trusted for regular matzahs, the rabbis here say to avoid transgressing the prohibition of chametz, as it would technically be sufficient to assess dough prepared by a goy for signs of leavening. And if found to be unleavened, the person could then technically bake it, consume it on Pesach. But for the mitzvah of eating matzah at the Seder, a Jew has to actively guard the dough-making process, and that's what we refer to as Shmurah Matzah. So, turn to the Gemara in Tractate Pesachim, Daf Mem Amud Aleph 48. Hadar Amarava Mitzvah Liltot Shnemar Ushmartem et Chamatzot Ila Davai Latita Shimur Lema Ishimur Delisha Lav Shimur Hu. So Rava says he reconsidered and then said, is it not only permitted to soak grains, it is actually a mitzvah to soak them. As the verse says, and you shall guard the matzahs, Ushmartem et Chamatzot. Exodus chapter 12, verse 17. The Gemara explains the statement. If it isn't the case that grain requires soaking, for what purpose is guarding necessary? If you claim that this verse is referring to guarding when kneading the dough, that cannot be the case, because guarding grain while kneading is not considered guarding. If one failed to protect the wheat from becoming chametz until that point, it is of no use to be careful while kneading it. So the mitzvah to guard the dough can't be referring to the kneading stage. Damar Rav Huna, Tzekot Shulgoyim, Adam Amalik Reisa Mechenu Vivad Yochal Kazait Matzah Bachrona, Bachrona Im Barishona La. So, as Rav Huna says, in the case of dough prepared by Goyim, One knows that it does not become chametz. A person could fill his stomach with them on Leil Pesach on the night of Pesach, provided that he eats a kazayit of matzah in the end to fulfill the obligation to eat matzah. So the Gemara infers from the statement that with regard to the matzah that he eats in the end, yes, he fulfills his obligation with the matzah, but with regard to the matzah he ate in the beginning, no. He does not fulfill the matzah with the mitzvah of matzah with dough prepared by Goyim. Mataima, Yishum delava behushimor velabeid leishimor meafia ve'elach. Elavav shemamina shimor meikara ve'enan. So what is the reason that one cannot fulfill his obligation to eat matzah with dough prepared by Goyim? It is because he didn't perform his duty to guard the dough. But one could perform his duty to guard it from the time of baking and onward. Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from this brisa that the grain must be guarded from the beginning, meaning from the time that it's soaked, which proves that soaking the grain is part of the process of preparing matzah? Mima, no mashani atam di vidana denache l'shimor laved l'shimor. Alhecha di vidana denache l'shimor aved l'shimor. Hachinami l'shimor delisha have shimor. The Gemara rejects this. And from where do we know that this conclusion is correct? Perhaps it is different there, as at the time when guarding is required. That is, when water was added to the flour, he didn't perform his duty to guard it properly. However, in a case where at the time when guarding is required, when water is added to the flour, he properly performed his duty to guard it, and so too it's possible that guarding flour at the time of kneading is considered a proper guarding. Therefore, the question can't be resolved based on the case of dough prepared by Goy. Lehanudim hapikhi kefe. Ki mehapichitu hapichu l'shum mitzvah. Alma desava shima meikara mitchilato v'ad sofo beinan. And although this proof was rejected, Rava didn't retract his statement that guarding grain must begin before kneading. For he would say to those who cut and tied the stalks, the kife of grain in the field, when you cut the grain, cut it for the purpose of the mitzvah. So Rava holds that it's necessary to guard the grain from the outset, that is, from the beginning of its preparation until its end, from the time of Kitsira, through grinding and then kneading. So liltosh means they used to soak barley or the wheat kernels in water before they used it for matzah, which is interesting because it's the soaking in water that would cause it to become chametz. 18 minutes, you take wheat, you take barley, it becomes wet, you soak it in matzah, 18 minutes, you get chametz, or at least potential chametz. And the Gemara says this is right, but there is a mitzvah to watch over the grain to make sure that it doesn't become chametz. So we're basically creating an opportunity for ourselves to watch over the grain in order that it shouldn't become chametz. So Maravim, the mitzvah liltosh is a mitzvah to soak the grain, shneim or Ushmartem et hamatzot, and watch over the grain. So ilo debayil l'sisa, if you're not going to soak it, what are you watching it for? Right. So flour mixed with water chametz. Like so. What are you soaking the grains in water for? Um, Damarav Huna, Sekel Shanoch Riyadim Memali Kirsabahan of Vivad Shayochel Pisay Matzbachorna. We already said that they had these loaves that were baked by non-Jews, but they could tell that it wasn't chametz. So it's not good for the mitzvah of matzah. It has to be watched over for the purpose of the mitzvah of matzah. Bachronain barishona lo, but you can eat this as long as it's not as long as it's not chametz. You can eat it on Pesach, but you need Shmurah Matzah for the mitzvah of matzah. So says Rava, what else are you going to do? When else are you going to do this? If you're not going to soak the grains in water, you have to have Shmurah Matzah. So my tama mishum delo havi shimor. Shimor guarding is what you need for the mitzvah of matzah. Um, So that way you could use the bitzaka shel nochri, the dough of a nochri. You could tell it hasn't become chametz, but you can't use it for the mitzvah matzah because it wasn't washed over. So they used to have doughs which they could tell wasn't fully baked bread. Um, you're right, the Jew could take it and bake it. They could tell by looking at it that it wasn't chametz yet. Still, you can't use it though for the mitzvah of matzah because there has to be guarding. It has to be watched over. So watching over it was already made into a dough is not enough. Um, you have to have guarding way before just the time of baking, because we see that they would take these doughs from non-Jews and they baked them. Wasn't good enough for the mitzvah of matzah. So even though you know it's not chametz, it wasn't good enough for the mitzvah of matzah. You need something extra. You need a shmurah. You need a watching over for the purpose of the mitzvah, and it has to take place before the uh, the time of kneading. So the question is, when do you need to watch over it so that it shouldn't become chametz? Um, so obviously, the whole process has to be supervised. There's no doubt about that the whole process requires supervision. Um, but certainly it has to take place for the time of, when we're actually mixing the flour with water, right? Mixing the flour with water is what causes, that is what causes, chametz, right? You take Pesach flour, right? Regular flour is not kosher for Pesach because of the way it's produced. But you take a Passover friendly flour, you mix it with water, 18 minutes, you get chametz. So guarding from the time of Lisha, but guarding from the time of kneading be sufficient. Um, at the time of when it could potentially come chametz, is that enough? Regular matzah is made in that way. That's how regular matzah gets made. There's supervision from the time of, when the dough is made. Is there supervision? Is there guarding at the time of when the flour, the wheat is ground? Um, so Rava derived from here that you have to watch over it from an earlier point, that you have to soak the grains in water to watch over it from the time that it was cut, it seems, even before it's made into flour. Um, we don't really see that maybe Rava has such a great proof over here. Um, maybe it's enough to just watch over the flour once it's mixed with water, mishat lisha from the time of kneading. Um, he doesn't back down nonetheless. If you he stuck to his position. All right, Rava tells those who are working the fields, cutting the grain, that when you're cutting the grain, you have to cut the grain l'shem mitzvah. You see that nowadays. You often see in the Jewish papers, right? You buy a newspaper like the Jewish Press or the Yated Neman or the Hamodia, or you go by Main Street in Queens. They have, the Free Jewish papers. You often see these rabbis. Usually, it's Hasidic Rebbeim. You see the Hasidic Rebbeim in Arizona going into the fields cutting the grain. Um, it's to be choshesh to the opinion, to be concerned for the opinion of Rava that when you're cutting the grain, you should cut it l'shem mitzvah. Interesting. You never see a YU rabbi out there, but you will see, Chabad Rabbanim or Hasidic Rabbanim, but usually not a YU Rav. Um, right? So I'm a kasava shimur meikara mitchilat toviat sofa beinan. So Rava holds that you need guarding from the very moment that the grain's coming into the world. When it's cut, that's already when you need guarding shimur. So how do we rule? Um, Rov Rishon and most of the early authorities, they paskin shimur mishat lisha ve'elach, that you really only need guarding from the time of kneading, when it becomes a dough, not from the time of kitsira, not from the time of cutting the grain. Um, because the Gemara seems to say that the reason why you can't use these doughs made by non-Jews for the mitzvah of matzahs because you weren't there when it became dough. In other words, they would look at these doughs, analyze it, make sure it wasn't chametz, and they would use it for sort of the regular day-to-day bread of Pesach, regular matzah. Think of it like Horowitz Margaretin, that you smear butter on in the morning, right? Um, but not but you could not use matzah of that nature for the seder, for the mitzvah. Um, the opinion of most Rishonim, though, is that for the seder, for the mitzvah of matzah, for what we would call Shmurah Matzah, there only needs to be guarding for the sake of the mitzvah from the time that it becomes dough, which would be from when the flour was mixed with the water. The Rosh says, Kilomar filu shenidchu divrei rabba by the Maimor, the Shimur, the Lisha, the Shimur, who Afilu Hachi, the Hadar, the Yomachmir Alatz, Machaya Lishmur Matzah, Shal Mitzvah, Mishat Kitsira. That is to say that even though Rava's words were rejected, since he wanted to say that the guarding done at the time of grinding, Lisha is not considered valid, he didn't retract his position. He was stringent to guard the matzah used for the mitzvah from the time of reaping. So these rebbeim that you see in the fields, they really are being strict for the position um, of Rava that you need to have guarding from the time of um, the harvest of the grain. And it appears that this is a chumer ba'alma, merely a mere stringency of chulei, etc. V'nahugu ba'ashkenaz v'sarfat l'shomron mishat china. Fisha az makriven otan el elamayim shetochanan berachayim shamayim. He says that the practice, the custom, the way that they're accustomed in Ashkenaz, Germany, and Sarfat, France, is to guard them from the time of grinding, not from the time of reaping, cutting the grain, but from the time of when the wheat is ground into flour. Because at that point they bring them near to water because they grind. Where do you grind flour? Or at least back then in a water mill, right? Water comes into contact with that grain. 18 minutes, you get hummus. Rav Alfas katav umi beile literatory kimcha de pischa mishat kitsir dichti Ushmartem et chamatzoi. And the Rif, Rav Alfas wrote, and he should have needed to guard the Pesach flour from the time of reaping, as it is written, Ushmartem et chamatzoi, you should guard the matzvahs. So he says that the Rif, though, um, takes a more stringent stance that, like Rava, that really the Pesach flour should have been guarded from the time of when the wheat was reaped. So this is the Rosh and Perik Beit Siman Chavav 227. Even though Rava was disproven, he had no proof to what he said. He held that Shimur just from the time it becomes dough is not good enough. He didn't retract the Lishma Matzah Shal Mitzvah Mishat Kitsira. would watch over from the time that you know it was cut. V'chein mashma the chumra balmahu. This is a stringency. It's a chumra. Nahagu b'Ashkenaz v'sarv mishum mishat china. He said that the Rosh said that there were those who adopted a chumra, but the practice that he saw in Germany and France was that they would guard it from the time that you make it into flour. So even though they wouldn't watch over just from the time it's made into dough, they would at least watch over it a little bit earlier from the time it was made into flour, which is kind of a stringency in and of itself, the Rosh says, right? He says that this was the practice, that they would guard from the time of making into flour. Um, and the Rosh says that even though he thinks it's a Chumar Ba'alma, he quotes the Rif, who paskins like Rava. And the Rambam actually holds the same. Now, the Rambam in Hilchos Chometz Halacha Tes says the same as the Rif. Shulchan Aruch, by the way, is based off of the Rif, the Rambam, the Rosh. So we'll see how Shulchan Aruch makes sense of the Rif and the Rambam on the one hand, the Rosh on the other. It says the Rambam, Mishum Shenemar Ushmartem et Chamatzot, Kilomar Hizaru B'Matzah V'Shmurah Kol Tzad Chimutz. Lefichach Amru Chachamim Zarich Adam Lehizacher Dagan Shulchan B'Minu B'Pesach Shelo Yavo Lav Mayim Achar Shenitzar Actually Yibov Shum Chimutz. So he says that the verse says, right, Exodus chapter 12, verse 17, it says, keep watch over the matzah, to be careful of the matzahs, protect them from any possibility of becoming chametz. All right, so Rambam is saying here, he's implying that the flour and the matzahs made from the flour have to be washed with the specific intent that they be used for the mitzvah of eating matzah and Pesach, Seder, the first night, second night. Hence the source for the practice of eating Shmurah Matzah. Matzah made from grain which has been washed to ensure that it didn't become chametz, prepared with the intention that it be used for the mitzvah of eating matzah, which for the Seder, it's an absolute requirement. Continues the Rambam, the sages declare that a person has to be careful regarding the grain that he eats on Pesach, and we see from our Gemara, and the Rambam is concerned for this opinion of Rava, like the Rif. We see in Pesachim Daf Mem Amud Aleph 40a, Rava would tell the harvesters cutting wheat for Pesach, have the intent that this grain be used for the mitzvah of matzah. Be sure that no water has come into contact with it after it has been harvested. So, based on our Gemara and Pesachim, the Rif and the Rambam require that the grain be watched from the time of harvesting onward. The Rosh follows a more lenient position, doesn't require that the wheat be watched until it's ground into flour. The Ran in the Dape Harif explains, though, that even the Rif only recommended watching the matzah from harvesting it as sort of a pious measure, not as an absolute rule. So there's a preference. The Rif is saying that there's a preference for this. You see in the Shulchan Aruch later on, in Tuf Nun Gimel, Seif Dalid, 453.4, the Shulchan Aruch will say that it's preferable to use grain that has been watched from harvesting as a minimum requirement, though it only has to be grain that was watched from the time that it was ground into flour. And if you really had no other alternative, you could just follow what the Gemara says, buy flour from the marketplace and begin watching from the time that the dough is kneaded, right? Shimur Mishat Lisha. Now, the Mishnah Berurah, though, clarifies, and this is true of modern days, the way we make flour. The grain is washed, it's submerged in water before grinding into flour. That's why we can't use it for matzah at all. So in practice, most Shmurah Matzah, it's made at present. It's guarded from the time the grain was harvested, like what the Rambam says and like what the Rif suggests, to avoid any possibility that it should become a chametz. But the Gemara says that even though it doesn't have to be watched from the time of harvest, like Rava, it's sufficient to have been watched in the beginning of the kneading process. That is to say, when the grain is first mixed with water and could conceivably become a chametz. Um, we see that Rava's opinion um, is the source of the practice we have nowadays that we should have matzah shmura mishat katsira, that we have shmura matzah from the time of the harvest. So we follow this opinion even when the Gemara doesn't really find support for it and seems to include the guarding from the time of kneading suffices. And the Rambam here, like the Rif, they maintain that the Gemara brings Rav Shita in order to teach us that it should be considered normative, despite the fact that it seems to be at variance with the Gemara's conclusion. Now, the Rambam and probably the Rif as well, they hold that Rav Shita is more machmir than the Gemara's conclusion in another way. The Rambam holds that Rava requires guarding humor not just for matzah eaten at the Seder, but for all grain that one consumes on Pesach. And so this Rambam is the source for the practice to only eat all of Pesach matzah that is shmur mishat ketzira. That like Rava's opinion, it's matzah made from flour that was guarded from the time of the harvest. Now, Magid Mishneh, though, points out that even though this is ideal according to the Rambam and the Rif, maybe it's not an absolute ironclad requirement for the Seder, let alone for the rest of Pesach, because we have in our Gemara um, a statement from Rav Huna, which says that if a person doesn't have enough Shmurah Matzah, both, let's say you don't have enough for the Seder, for the matzah eating at the Seder and the Hillel sandwich, let's say you don't have enough matzah for that, and as well as for the afikomen at the end. Rav Huna says that you should save the Shmurah Matzah for the afikomen for the end of the meal. Because remember what we said in our Gemara. Right? What did Rav Huna in the Gemara say? Right? 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 I'm a Rav Huna, but it's like what Shulgoyim, Adam Amale, Kurisa Mechenu Vavad Shiochel Kasei Matzah Ba'achrona in Barishona La, right? If one knows that it hasn't become Chometz, you could fill your stomach with them on Pesach night, this non-Shmurah Matzah, provided that you have a kazayit at the end, Yafikomen, in order to fulfill the mitzvah obligation. You see? Um, so you should save that limited quantity of Shmurah Matzah for the Afikomen, the rest of the Seder. You use non-garlic matzah. And this is what the Rambam paskins in Perek Ches Halacha Yud Gimel in the Mishnah Torah. So we'll take a look there. The Rambam there goes through the halachas of the Seder. Rambam. So the Rambam there says, Misha ein matzah mishmeret el kazayit, keshagomer sudato mi matzah she'ena mishmeret mevarech alechil matzah v'choloto kazayit ve'eno toim acharav klum. So the Rambam there, he paskins like Rav Huna, brings the halacha that a person who has only a single kazayit, only a single olive's bulk of Shmurah Matzah, um, when he concludes eating his meal from matzah that was not Shmurah Matzah, um, he would say the blessing of Alachilat Matzah, eat that kazayit for the afikomen, and he doesn't taste anything afterward, which we know is the main principle of eating the afikomen, that after you eat the afikomen on Passover, you're not allowed to eat any food after. Now, first of all, who would want to eat more food at that point? Because it's 11, 12 o'clock at night, and we already had such a nice meal for Pesach, and we ate all the other things in the Seder. Um, so you don't taste anything after except for the cup. You could have, we possibly you could have water, you could have seltzer, you could even have coffee if, you need to stay up at night in order to, continue discussing the miracle, the story of how we're leaving Egypt, Magid, Sipur Yitzhak Mitzrayim. But the idea is that it should be the last food you'll eat, so that way the mitzvah sort of stays within your mouth. Now, Magid Mishneh explains this additionally. He says, "V'lo nizkar b'alachot v'lo b'divrei Rabbeinu shum chaluk bein matzah shel laila rishon lematzah shel l'mochel b'shar yemei Pesach ela shebesov arvei Pesachim katav harav alfasi zelashono hechadali lekula sudata mimatzah tara ela kazayit b'chot demantar chudiyik le'achil berisha." And no distinction was mentioned in the Rif nor in the words of the Rambam between the matzah of the first night and the matzah a person eats on the other days of Pesach, except that at the end of Arvei Pesachim, the Rif says, where a person doesn't have his entire meal from Shmurah Matzah, but only a kazayat that with Shmurah, he should eat that first. And he brings the Rambam we just said, right? The Rambam, our master, says at the end of Parakhet, Mi she'ein l'matzah mishmet ela kazayit v'chulei her zichronim levracha she'shamur enu me'akev v'lechtchila roi l'soda b'chol hadagan ela she'enu me'akev ela b'leila charishon shel chova lechol matzah ha'mishmeret v'zeh chreach b'farish b'divreichem. So he says that the sages ruled, or I'm sorry, they ruled, they Zichronim Levracha ruled, they paskin that Shmur is not essential, it's not Ma'akev, ain't a Ma'akevet, for the rest of Pesach. And ideally, it's proper to do it with all grain, meaning all the matzah you eat should be, or whatever you eat for matzah meal, it should all be Shmurah Matzah. But it's really only essential on the first night, where you have an obligation to eat matzah that's guarded. And this is necessary to explain in their words. So this sort of positive vigilance of Shmurah Matzah that we read about in the Pesach of Ushmartem et um, they say that ideally it's proper practice that this should apply to all of the matzah that we eat during Pesach. So all of the matzah that you have for, the Shabbos meals and the Yom Tov daytime meals and, Chol Hamoed, you're supposed to wash, supposed to have bread, matzah, Chol Hamoed. Right, and the Vilna Gaon holds that there is a mitzvah actually to eat matzah the other days of Pesach as well. So they're saying properly it should be Shmurah Matzah meal, Shmurah Pesach rolls, Shmurah Pesach kichels, whatever. But it's not strictly required for matzah eating during the remaining days. But it is essential for the first night. And really, as sort of a second best thing, if you only had a little amount of Shmurah Matzah, then only a kazayit, an olive's bulk, then you would use that for afikomen and use regular matzah for the other, for the other parts of the seder. So after the fact, it would seem like a kazayit of Shmurah Matzah might suffice for the afikomen. You could use regular Pesach matzah for the rest. Now, the recommendation of Rava and the idea that you should only have Shmurah Matzah throughout Pesach, there are many people who follow that. They want to do things in an optimal way. There are many people that will only eat Shmurah Matzah throughout Pesach. It's going above and beyond what the halacha requires. Shulchan Aruch that we mentioned before in Taf Nun Gimel, Sif Dalet says, "Chitim shosim behem matzah mitzvah tov l'shamron shelo yiplu aleihem mayim mishat yitzir lefacho vishat achinu vishat adachak mutar likach kemach min hashuk." That it is good to make the mitzvah matzah from wheat that has been guarded so that no water has fallen on it from the time of harvest, or at least from the time since it was ground into flour. But in a shasad chak, in times of duress, it's permitted to buy flour from the shuk, the marketplace. So, even though the Rif and the Rambam is such central poskim, everybody else, such as the Rosh, disagrees with them. Rava's shita that if it's to be accepted at all, should only apply to the matzah used to fulfill the mitzvah of the Seder. And for the rest of Pesach, we don't need shimur at all. Basic halacha follows the Gemara's conclusion that you could buy flour and not begin guarding the matzah for the Seder until the time of Lisha kneading. Right? The Rosh says that since the Gemara rejects Rava's stringent definition of Shmira from the time of Kitzira, from the time of the harvest, it's only a personal stringency of Chumra Ba'alma that the grain be watched from the time of the harvest. However, there was a compromise. The Rosh says that in practice, in Ashkenaz, at least in France, Germany, they weren't so lenient as to just follow the Gemara's basic halacha that you only have to supervise matzah from the time of kneading. They compromised that Shmurah Mishat Techina, guarding from the time of when the grain was milled into flour, which he felt made sense because the mills were water powered in them days. So, interestingly, the Shulchan Aruch here doesn't even mention this sheet of the Rif and the Rambam. It doesn't mention Rava's Chumrah. And it says, beferish, it says explicitly that the requirement of shimur, the requirement of guarding, applies only to the matzah used for the seder. And preferably, there should be guarding from the time of harvest, like Rava, but guarding from the time of milling, like the Rosh, is also acceptable. And Shulchan Aruch says that if nothing else was available, they could even use matzahs for the seder with flour from the marketplace, meaning in a chassid chak, it could be flour that there was no shimur whatsoever. As we said, though, nowadays that wouldn't count because the flour we make nowadays, it is steamed, it's in contact with water, it's chometz. Flour back then wasn't necessarily chometz. So, according to the Shulchan Aruch, which follows the vast majority of opinions, all matzah eat on Pesach can theoretically be made for flour that is not shmurah, that was not specially supervised, except for the matzah used at the Seder. Gemara Maseches Pesachim Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph through base teaches us more about this. It says Chala Toda Rikike Nazir V'Chule Menahani Mile Amar Rabba Damar Kara. We learned in the Mishnah that if one prepared the loaves of a Toda, of a thanks offering, or a Nazarite's wafers for himself, a Nazarite, one who takes a Nazarite vow, it's a thing back then, they kind of make themselves like a semi-Kohen status, a sanctified status. So he would make these wafers for himself, a Nazir person. We had Korbanos back then. They would make, a thank offering, a korban toda. They would make a toda. Um, so we see again the idea being intention, right? They made these loaves, even though if they didn't have chametz in it, right? Could eat it on Pesach, but because they didn't have the intention of making it for the mitzvah, they made it for the purpose of a thanks offering or for a Nazir's wafers for himself. He cannot use them to fulfill his obligation to eat matzah on Pesach. And Gemara asks, where do we learn this from? Where do we learn this from? Rabbi says, the Pasuk states, Ushmartem et hamatzot, matzah hamishtameret l'shem mitzvah, yatzta zoshe mishtameret l'shem mitzvah, eila l'shem zevach. You shall guard the matzahs. We learn that from the Pasuk, the verse that we've been saying, um, teaches that one may use only matzah that has been guarded from becoming chometz for the sake of the mitzvah. That is, with the intention of fulfilling one's obligation of matzah with it. And this explanation excludes this matzah that was prepared for a nazir, or that was prepared for a zevach toda, for a thanks offering, which was not guarded for the purpose of matzah, but for the purpose of a sacrifice. Rav Yosef Amar Makra, O Shivat Yamim Matzot Tochlu Matzah Hanecheled, the Shivat Yamim Yatzta Zo, Sheina Necheled, the Shivat Yamim Elu Yom Palayla. Rav Yosef gives a different reasoning, that one may not use matzah prepared for a nazir or thanks offering because the pasuk says, matzah nechel l'shivat yamim, that you shall eat matzah for 7 days, which indicates that one can fulfill his obligation only with matzah that can be eaten for all 7 days. This requirement excludes this matzah, which is of a nazir's wafers or the loaves of a thanks offering, and which cannot be eaten for 7 days, but only for 1 day and 1 night. Rashi here says, Ushmartem et chamatzot, ibid the Shmurah Matzah, ibid l'shem mitzvah. Kol shima shata mishmera shelo tachmit tzitkavein l'shem matzah shel mitzvah. I'm sorry, avid l'shmir l'shem matzah. That you shall guard the matzahs, guarded for the purpose of matzah. Every time you guard it from becoming chametz, you should have in mind the mitzvah of matzah. You shall guard the matzahs, perform it for the guarding for the sake of matzah. Every guarding that you guard it so that it should not become chametz, intend for the sake of the mitzvah of the commandment, for the sake of the matzah, rather of the mitzvah of matzah mitzvah. It's what matzah. Yatzar chule de l'shem matzah shel mitzvah pesach aviva. Hela l'shem matzah shel zevach. You have fulfilled, for he didn't perform it for the sake of the matzah of the Pesach commandment, but rather for the sake of the matzah of sacrifice. Doesn't work. That's the whole point here, is that this Gemara is saying that the matzah that you use for the Seder has to be made for the purpose, has to be made with the intention of using it for the mitzvah of matzah. So, and what does this mean practically? That it's made for the purpose of the Seder. So we know that it has to be made Lishma. There has to be the intention that it's made for the mitzvah. What about the guarding? When do you have to watch over it? Right. So we saw in the Rambam, um, sort of two options. I'm sorry, two options in Shulchan Aruch. One from the Rambam, which says, like Rava, Shnei Ushmartem et Chamatzot, Yishvach of the Matzot, Kaloma, Yizache b'Matzot, Shomim Nikol Tzar Chimutz, Lefika Cham Racham, Yisarech Adam, Yizache b'Dagan Shalcham, Nimero b'Pesach Shlo Yavo Olav Mayim, Acher Sheniksar Ad Shlo Yaseh Shum Chimutz. So, Acher Sheniksar means the time that it's cut. Shulchan Aruch gives two opinions. The Chitim Shosim Bachem Batzot Mitzvah Tov, the Shomrim Shelo Yipol Leha Mayim Mishat Ketzira. From the time that it's good to watch over it, from the time of the Ketzira, from the time of cutting it, cutting the grain, which is what we call Shmurah Matzah. We call Shmurah Matzah Shimor Mishat Ketzir Ve'elach. And what everybody calls regular matzah, non-Shmurah Matzah, it's really not a double negative here, not non-Shmurah Matzah. It's a different kind of Shmurah. It's guarded Mishat Lisha Ve'elach. It's guarded from the time of kneading. So regular OU matzah, Manischewitz matzah, according to many Rishonim, many early authorities, you would actually still fulfill the mitzvah. It would be good enough because there's guarding from the time when it's made into dough. We call Shmurah Matzah that's made from grain that was washed over Mishat Katsir Ve'elach from the time of when the grain was cut. That is the chumrah of the Rambam in the Rif. And the Shulchan Aruch says it's good to watch over Mishat Katsira, the Fachot Mishat Techina. Although from the time of from the time of guarding, like the Rosh says, like the Chumrah of Ashkenaz that the Rosh quoted, from the time that it's made into flour. But in times of difficulty, you could take flour from the marketplace, use it for the mitzvah matzah, as long as you watch over it from the time it's made into dough, which, as we said, does not apply to flour nowadays, because the flour that we have nowadays, a bag of Pillsbury flour, let's say, it's bleached, it's washed, it's actual chametz, and it's something that you would have to get rid of on Pesach. Um, Practically speaking, the flour that we use for Pesach, for matzah, it has to be supervised because contemporary commercial flour, they use tempered grain, wetted grain. And as such, flour min hashuk nowadays is actual chametz, and it can't be used during the holiday at all. So for this reason, all matzah produced nowadays is actually shimur. It's shmurah matzah mishat Vishat Chatchina from the time of milling. Just like what the Rosh says we need to do. We're concerned for that. So non-Shmurah Matzah, regular kosher matzah for Pesach that we buy nowadays is Shmurah Mishat Techina. And according to the old Ashkenaz standard of the Rosh, this would suffice to be used at the Seder. And it would be more than acceptable for use throughout Pesach, according according to those opinions. Also, the Rava Rif Rambam notwithstanding. Right. So on our Gemara Rashi, he says that, and we'll say Rashi outside. He says, let's say there were two korbanos, two sacrifices that used to bring matzah with the korban, right? With the chalas toda or the rikike nozir. Does the korban toda, the Thanksgiving offering that they would bring matzah with the korban toda, and also the rikike nozir, the wafers of the nozir, the Nazirite. So it can't become chametz for those purposes. It has to be kosher for Pesach. But can I use it for the mitzvah of the Seder if it's not made with that intention? Is it non-transferable? Or can I use it for the mitzvah of matzah too? And as we noted, the Gemara says no. Matzah mishtameret l'shem matzah, yatzu mishtameret l'shem matzah l'shem zamach. It's only watched over for the purpose not of the mitzvah of the Seder, but for a korban, for a sacrifice. So Rashi there explains Kol Shemashata Mishamer Shalot Techametz Yitchavin L'Shem Matzah Shel Mitzvah. What does it mean to have Shmurah Matzah according to Rashi? That the matzah that's made for the purpose of the mitzvah of matzah. So this would be, we could give maybe a mushroom, we could give maybe a comparable case. Right, so Lishma, that's something be done for its own sake. A Sefer Torah has to be done this way, tzitzit has to be tied this way. A get has to be written Lishma for the purpose of the divorce of these two individuals. Right, you can't write a generic get, post it on the wall of the Clearview Jewish Center, on the wall of Chafetz Chaim Yeshiva, wherever else you want to go in Queens. You can't do that so that anybody can come and fill it in. It has to be something that's written specifically for these two individuals. If not, it's not a get. So Rashi too feels that in order to create matzah, it has to be made for the sake of the mitzvah. It has to be made l'shma. L'shem mitzvah for the purpose of the mitzvah. L'shem matzah. The words in Hebrew, often appear the same. Interestingly, that vowels. So it's l'shma, like the writing of a Sefer Torah, like ketivat a get, like the writing of a get. And if that's the case, however, then when would you call the matzah coming into the world with l'shem mitzvah? Meaning, when is the beginning of the processing of the matzah? If the whole process of shimur, if the whole process of guarding is to create matzah, l'shem mitzvah, when does this become like a matzah, let's say? Right? Is it, this is like a great debate, by the way. If anybody's ever seen the episode of Seinfeld where um, it's sort of like a double entendre, this episode. But there's an episode of Seinfeld where, Kramer and Poppy get together and they have this make your own pizza thing. Kramer wants to put cucumbers on a pizza. And by a similar token, there's a dispute about abortion in the episode. Poppy says it's a pizza the moment you put your hands in the dough. And Kramer says it's not a pizza till it comes out of the oven. So we kind of have lahavdil meya havdalos. We kind of have a similar dispute here, right? Is it matzah from the time that the flour is mixed with the water, or is it matzah? Does it have to come out of the oven for it to be matzah? Um, right. So if we say that we could have the intention that it's matzah from the time the flour is mixed with water, then it is already l'shem matzah. Before that, it's davar shelo ba'olam. It's not anything that exists yet in the world because not every grain is destined to become matzah. Every flour is not destined to become matzah. Once I mix it with the water in the matzah factory, that's okay. But otherwise, not the case. So when does it become matzah that I perhaps would need l'shem mitzvah? Perhaps from the time of when we're mixing, we're making the dough bishat lishaveh. So maybe we need the intention. That makes sense that the intention applies from the time that we begin making the dough, because practically, um, the way we make quote unquote Shmurah Matzah, the flour comes in from a place where they grind it where it's ground under supervision. So the grinding of the flour, there is supervision. There is shimur there, like what the Rosh says we need, because we're concerned for like a watermill. But the intention that it be used, that this is matzah that we're making l'shem this matzah, um, it really applies from the time when we're making it into dough. Um, so we kind of have like a machlokas rishonim here that will be something to flesh out. So you have rishonim who say that, like the Rif and the Rambam, who say that you need shimur mishat ketzira. They don't believe, like Rashi held, that the shmir or the guarding is to make it to transform it into matzah l'shem, this was matzah, like writing a Torah or get. Right? It seems to be two different things. So, right, the Rambam said that you need shimur mishat ketzira, that you need guarding from the time that it's cut. And that's because he believes Shmurah Matzah doesn't mean to transform it into matzah. That's l'shem mitzvah matzah, like the writing of a sefer Torah, like a get, that it means Lishma, like Rashi says. Right? He says what it means is achar sheniksar ad both chimus, that the requirement of the shimur, the requirement of the guarding, is to prevent it from becoming um, chametz, from preventing the leavening. Right? So the guarding was so that we would know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it wasn't chametz. It didn't make it lishma, didn't make it, like the writing of a get or a sefer Torah. It had to be, though, guarded above and beyond the general standard to make sure that it's not chametz. So if that's the case, when is the first time that the wheat that you're going to use for matzah could become chametz? Mishat ketzira ve'elach. Become chametz if it got mixed with water, starting from mishat tekin, starting from the time of the grinding. So that's why the Rambam felt from Matzah's mishat ketzira ve'elach, that it's from the time of the harvest. Rashi said it had to be made l'shem mitzvah. Rambam doesn't believe it has to be made l'shem mitzvah. That you just need sort of an extra supervision. Continues the Rosh. With the Ilta Parshat Tzav Simin Ayin Hekatav Le Nefak Inyer Yudei Chovat Toile B'Matzah Deminta Le Nechimutz Min Tenafla Ma'iluya. The Rosh brings from the Sheiltos of Rav Chaigon and Parthik Tzav that person doesn't fulfill his obligation for the Seder except with matzah that's guarded by him from becoming chametz from the time that the water falls upon it. So, according to the Shieltos, the obligation of Shimur applies really from the time that um, water begins to fall upon it. The Rosh elsewhere said that really this would mean that because water-powered mills were used, like what he's describing in Ashkenaz, it would mean that you need supervision, you need shimur, mishas techina, not just from the time that water falls upon it, which would really mean from the beginning of the matzah making process. So when a non-Jew, and again, this is where the aspect of that it be done l'shem mitzvah comes in. He says that if it's made, if the dough is made by a non-Jew, deaf mute, a mentally incompetent person, or a minor, they brought the wheat to the water, he doesn't fulfill his obligation. Iname lashli isa nochri chereshoti v'katan dela b'nei shimor. Even v'yaf al pi defi Yisrael bar deya v'yavi b'chushim or b'shatafia. Lo navigdei chovticha v'chulei. Similarly, if a goy, a deaf mute or a mentally incompetent person, a minor, if they needed the dough, since they're not capable of shimor, they're not capable of guarding like a Samaritan, and even though a knowledgeable Jew, a full-fledged Israelite, baked it and performed the guarding at the time of baking, one does not fulfill the obligation. So we need to have shimor. We need to have this aspect of supervision in place from the time where the water hits the dough and from the time of when the dough is then being kneaded. Rav Chaigain, Zichron Lefrach Ktav Matzah, She'afi Nachri Lefnei Yisrael Ali Deshimur, Ketikunim Mutarat Yisrael Echela. Chaigain says matzah that a non-Jew baked before a Jew with the guarding done properly is permitted for a Jew to eat. Uvamali Matzah V'Chasidim V'Tamim Machmirin Alatzman Kigoinim Hamachmirin L'Shim V'Fim Batzman Ki Says those that are Bali Maseh, those that are pious, pure of heart, they're stringent upon themselves, like the Gainim who are stringent, like the Sheiltos. They grind and bake by themselves, as in that which we say, what is the way of an ani of a poor person? He grinds the wheat and his wife bakes. So, in other words, the Rosh is saying that we really should be machmir baking of matzah, that it needs to be done, that the grinding, the mixing with water, the kneading, that these are things that should be done really with shimor, things that should be done under supervision. And so says the Shulchan Aruch in Pav Samech Aleph Beis 460, Ein Lashon Matzah Mitzvah V'lo Oifino Ta'ayeh Dayenu Yehudi Lo Yedei Cheresh V'Katan. One should not knead or bake the matzahs for the Seder by these people who are not capable of shimor, a guy, a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a child. Rosh Chaya Mishtadel v'Matzah Mitzvah v'Amer al Sitia from Zaris Ha'oiskim B'Cher u'Mesiyeh Barich Tan v'chein rei l'cholim l'so l'hitatel l'hitafel hu ba'atzmo b'mitzvah, that the Rosh would personally deliberate on the matzahs mitzvah. He would oversee the production, inspire those working, and assisting them in the flattening of the dough. And he says, similarly, it's fitting for everybody to consign and devote themselves to this mitzvah. That a person, ideally, like what the Rosh is saying there from Rav Chaigain, that the pious ones, they're involved in doing it themselves. And this is why many people go in a chabura. They make matzahs in a factory, so it's actually quite an important thing, because the truth is that many of the matzah factories have been found to employ Russians, Ukrainians, Uzbeks, different people who actually are not really Jewish, but they get a job in the matzah factory, and that halachically is a problem. I would assume that reliable hakachas would certainly now try to really ascertain that people are halakhically Jewish when they hire them for these positions. But then again, who knows? Um, let's look at the Biur Halacha there. Biur Halacha Shem. Ein B'Torah Zacha Devata de Dugalisha V'Yafia Loy Mahani Omer Al Gabi Aval B'Tchina L'Chulei Alma Mahani B'Yisrael Shemed V'Roy Shelo Nase B'Zeh Shum Chashash Chimutz Aval Dasa El Yerabba B'Chulei. So the Biur Halacha brings from the Taz that his shita is that specifically kneading and baking, even standing over him doesn't help, but with grinding, according to all opinions, it helps if a Jew stands and watches that there be no concern of chametz done in it. But he says the opinion of the El Yerab is different. וככמח מן השוק בצ'ת חד מודה גם כן דמשד לי שווילך בין אנשימו לשמוע דווקא ויוסר על ידי עכו"ם וחרשות וקדן וכן משהו בביר הגר"א והמחבר נקד פה דבר דלכולי על מעשר. And that which the Mechaber specifies when kneading and baking, he mentioned the davar shepsika, a matter that's settled, that this is forbidden according to all opinions. For even a person who would permit buying flour from the market in a time of urgency, buying from the shuk, the Mechaber says, also concedes that from the time of kneading onward, we require guarding, more specifically for its sake, Lishma, and it would be forbidden to be done by a goy, a cheresh shaita. And so it appears in the Biur Hagra that it's a matter that's forbidden according to all shitas. So the Taz differentiates between different stages, right? Grinding tchin is less sensitive. But kneading and baking are more stringent stages where supervision would not bridge the gap of non-Jewish involvement. So this nafkamina, this distinction of the Taz is what happens in the Shmurah Matzah factories nowadays, right? So where they grind the flour, you do need shimur like what the Rosh is saying, there's guarding, right? So we have a distinction between shimur, guarding, and also who's actually involved in the production. Because in the production you need it to be done lishma, you need it to be done for the sake of the mitzvah. So the Taz makes this distinction. He says grinding tachin is less sensitive. You just need shimur supervision. The kneading and the baking are more stringent stages where supervision cannot bridge the gap of non-Jewish involvement. In other words, you need Jewish involvement in the kneading and the baking, which is why in the Shmurah Matzah factories, they only, at least theoretically, hire Jews supposed to be Shomer Shabbos. The Halach explains why the Mechaber specifies only kneading and baking, not because grinding is unimportant, but because he only wanted to say what was uncontested of Siga. And the question of grinding it's left implicit that you don't need that you don't need the grinding to be done the same bit, so you just need shimur. So even those lenient shitas, like what the Mechaber says, you buy the flour from the shuk, there's no shimur. But from the time of kneading onward, you have to have lishma, intentional purpose by somebody capable of that intention, which would exclude a goy, a katan, a cheresh, a shaita, right? Those disqualified categories of a non-Jew, a minor, a deaf mute, or an imbecile. Now, The Gemara in Maseches Gittin, Daf Chav Gimel Amid Aleph, brings us the case of, who's capable of writing a get. Right, we mentioned before that a get, like a Sefer Torah, you have to have also this aspect of Lishma, that it be written for its own sake, for the sake of the mitzvah, that it can't be like the Gemara Lamed Ches says that you make matzahs for zevach, for a sacrifice, or for the nazir, but this should be used for the seder. So the Mishnah there says, "Hakol kshir lichtov et haget afilu chereshot evakatan haisha kotevet et gita, vaish kotevet shavaro, she'ein kiyum haget ele bechotmav." So anybody is qualified to write a get, even a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor. Additionally, a woman may write her own bill of divorce and give it to her husband so that he can present it to her, and a man may write his own receipt, which must be given to him by the woman to confirm that he has paid her the value of her ksuba. This is because the ratification of a get is only through its signatories, and it's irrelevant who wrote it. Gemara says, "Vaila b'nei Nino, Amar Rav Huna, v'hu shehaya gadol amid al gabav." The Gemara asks, how can somebody who's not a bardeya, somebody who's not a bardas, somebody who can't give lishma, a deaf mute, an imbecile, a minor, how can they write a get? They're not halachically competent. They're not capable of writing a get with the intention that it be for a particular woman. They're not capable of lishma. And Rav Huna says that's only the case when there's an adult watching over them. But when the adult supervises the writing and instructs him to write it for his sake, it'll be valid. Right? It's like the case of a Samaritan. You have a Jew watching the shechita, a Jew watching the making matzah, maybe would be valid, although not for the mitzvah of matzah. Amarle Rav Nachman Elam at the goy v'Yisrael limit al gabav chachinami de chasher v'chitayim chachinami v'atanya goy posel goy ledate de nafshay aved. Nachman says to him, if that's so, then anybody who's puzzled, anybody who's disqualified from writing a get, may do so with an adult supervising him. Then if the one writing is a guy and a Jew stands over him and instructs him to write it for her sake, would you also say that it's valid? And if you would say that it's also valid, don't we see in a brace that a guy is puzzled, disqualified from writing get in any event? Rav Huna answers, a guy acts based according to his own ratzon, his own will. Since he is halachically competent, he'll have his own intentions while writing, and he can't be relied upon to carry out the intentions of the Jewish supervisor. In the case of the Mishnah, since those doing the writing are not halachically competent, right? Notice that the Mishnah specifically left out a guy, but included other puzzle categories. Will write according to the instructions of the Jew, the kosher adult Jew who's supervising. So, in other words, case of writing a get, a guy who's of sound mind, who knows the Hebrew, the Aramaic, he cannot write a get because he's going to have his own intentions. But a person such as a katan, the cherish, these categories of people, deaf, mute, and imbecile, and minor, they're Jewish, they don't have their own thoughts. They're capable of writing, they're capable of being trained, they're doing what you tell them, but they don't have their own thoughts, their own machshavas that could go and disrupt the lishma of the person who's telling them to write. According to this, if you had such workers in a matzah factory, it probably wouldn't be the worst thing. Beis Yosef brings as follows. He says, this case of matzah needed by a deaf, mute, and imbecile minor Jew. So, the Teshuas of Rashi B'chelik Alex and Chavav, Tavkaf Zad Gimel. So in the Chuvas of the Rashi, Mitzatish Nishal and Matzah Shloisha Cherish Retiv Akotim V'Nochri V'Cheshiv Decheven the Mitzvah Be'enon Shimur Ein Adam Yotzi B'Matzah Shloisha Nochri Afil B'Yisrael Limit Al Gabav Umasir Sheyachrin L'Shem Matzah L'Fi Shein Agoy Oisei Eile L'Dat Atzmo V'Lo Al Datam. So In Chuvas of the Rashba, um, I found that he was asked regarding matzah that was needed by a deaf, mute, an imbecile, a minor, and a goy. And the Rashba answers that since for matzah we require shimur, we need Lishma. A person doesn't fulfill his obligation with matzah needed by a goy, even if a Jew stands over him and instructs him to intend it for the sake of the matzah, of mitzvah's matzah, because the goy only acts according to his own understanding and not according to their intent. So the same idea from our Gemara here in Gittin about who could write a get applies to matzah. So a guy like a Samaritan, they could not. They could not make matzah for the Seder because they act according to their own understanding, not according to the Lishma that a Jewish overseer, Nomin al Gabav, would tell them to do. Amal b'cheresh devakata and yesh l'dun devaparak sheni to Gittin, or the dun deparak sheni to Gittin. Chaf base on the base. Tana de Charasher to Vakatan Kashim Lechtov get the Kimna Chaf Gimel. Aleph Begodulam and Al Gebechem. But regarding these other sort of categories of disability, a deaf, mute, an imbecile, a minor, there is room to be deliberate because, as we saw in our Gemara and Gittin, these three are valid to write a get as long as you have a gadol, an adult Jew with full capability, standing over them, telling them what to do. So Rashba says that because the goy acts l'das atzmo, they act according to their own understanding, not as agents of Jewish religious purpose. They cannot be involved in making Shmurah Matzah, that even direct supervision couldn't bridge the gap. But with a cheresh shaita v'katan, Rashba leaves it as an open question. Similarly, like a get, it should be valid that they would be able to make matzah for the Seder. So the hekesh, the analogy that Beis Yosef is giving from our Gemara and Gittin is, if the deaf mute, the mentally incompetent, and a minor, if they could write a valid get when supervised by proper Jewish supervision by an adult, maybe they could participate in matzah preparation under supervision under hashgacha. So the underlying principle is, what is the nature of the psul? What is the nature of the disqualification? So for Gittin, the issue was competence to execute a legal act. Supervision would seemingly suffice. You have these three categories of psul, then go right to get. But for matzah, the issue is kavana. For the mitzvah, the supervision, would a Jew standing over them enable this? Right? So does Shmurah Matzah require the guardian's own kavana, or can it be mediated through supervision? So we know that we need that extra step, right? The shimur that we require for the Seder would disqualify the matzah of Kusim, of Samaritans, because we know that while the Kutim were said to make sure that their matzah was not chametz, this extra standard of vigilance, that they're not able to do. They're not able to go that extra step, and that's what the mitzvah of Shmurah Matzah demands. Not that it be made Lishma, like Rashi says, though practically we hold we need that also, but there needs to be the extra vigilance to make sure that it doesn't become chametz. So practically, um, who can make matzah has to be made with. So we have the aspect of shimur, of guarding, but there also is the aspect of intentionality, that you need to have intentionality. The Shema, that it be said that it's being said for the sake of the mitzvah, preferably from the time the grain is harvested, but really, um, at least from the time of when we're mixing the dough. Um, And when buying Shmurah Matzah, not all brands take, not all hashgachas take the same positions, you know, but really the people that are involved in making the dough, rolling it out, putting it in the oven, all the employees working with flour, water, dough, they should be Shomer Shabbos. Um, Others don't necessarily insist on that. Um, so in addition to Shimur, we know that there has to be an aspect of Lishma, that there has to be an aspect of the proper intentions, and the workers involved with making the matzah ideally need to have the right intentions. So we say that we need Shimur, just supervision by the grinding. Um, Though ideally the grinding should be done the Shem Matzah mitzvah for the sake of the mitzvah matzah. Even the drawing of the water should be done this with the same intention. Um, but the workers, the people that are involved in making matzah, they should be Jewish adults that are able to do it Lishma. Um, Shomer Shabbos are believed to have the full capability of performing mitzvah acts Lishma with the right intentions. Um, if you have non-religious Jewish workers, as long as there's supervision, some would hold it's okay, some would not. Again, it depends on the brand. But there is a dispute over a case of Amid al-Gabav. If you have a Jew standing over a deaf-mute child, one who's mentally incompetent, tells them to have in mind for the mitzvah that it's that it be done like from There's a dispute over whether it's kosher, even b'diavad, even after the fact. Some would be lenient to rely upon the das of the adult Jewish supervisor. Um, Certainly, if one had a choice between matzah that was needed by a guy or a child, a minor, deaf mute, cherish, shaita, one should opt again that the non-Jew not be used because of what our Gemara in Gittin says about the guy having his own das. So that I hope explains some of the issues with Shmurah Matzah. Um, One thing that I will say, without going into too many of the um, details, but just given the economic reality this year, there's a very big dispute over machine matzah. Right, it was Dov Ben Manischewitz um, who made the matzah machine in the late 1800s, and at the time, obviously, you had those who insisted, that the machine was problematic due to, that you're really able to clean it out, to avoid chametz in between batches, and so forth. But more so with the machine, how do you have the aspect of lishma by a machine? So you obviously could have shmurah machine matzah. How does that work? Again, we have to look at these two issues of shimur and lishma as separate. So you have shmurah matzah that could be guarded even from the time of harvesting the wheat, like Rava's opinion and the Rif and the Rambam, and then they grind it under supervision. So the flour comes to the place, to the factory, Streitz or Manischewitz or oh, I'm not sure if they make machine shmurah matzah. I know that the Hadar company does. I know that Jerusalem Matzahs does. So you get the Shmurah Matzah flour in these places. You have machinery that does the mixing and all the aspects of the matzah production. So we see that we saw that you need a get has to be written lishma. Mishneh matzahs, we said watch for the sake of matzah. And Rashi there, Ushmartem, says that the Torah requires two tasks when it demands us to watch matzah. First, we have to do shimur guarding to make sure that it doesn't come chametz, and then also we have that aspect of Lishma, that it be made for the sake of the mitzvah. Right, the Rosh we saw from the Hilchos. He brings these two shitas. The Rosh that we saw, um, that the Hilchos says only matzah baked by a Jew would be acceptable for use because only this matzah is considered to be baked with mitzvah. And then he brings the shita of Haigain that if it was baked by a non-Jew but supervised by a Jew, then it's acceptable. Um, so supervision versus who's actually making it, two separate things, the Shimur versus the Lishma. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins like Rashi and the Shiltot that we need to have both Shimur to whatever extent we feel like it needs to be. Like the Shulchan Aruch by Shimur in 453 said, like Rava from the time of guarding, but really it only suffices from the time of grinding. And if one really needed to, they could just buy regular flour in those days, although nowadays that doesn't apply. Then we saw in the Mechaber, he says that it really does need to be made by a Jew for the sake of the mitzvah of matzah. Um, Machine Shmurah Matzah, there's a controversy over the Lishma aspect because, you know, in what way is a machine, let's say, comparable to the mentally incompetent, to a guy, to a cherish, um, to a katan? Um, those that don't allow the machine, they say that you need Lishma from an adult Jew. So how can a machine have that kind of intention when we have various categories of people who can't? Whereas the lenient opinion says that if the individual who presses the button to begin the automation process could have Lishma, then he declares it to be Lishma, and the machine does all the work that his hand would otherwise do. Um, so the question is, does pressing the button suffice? The strict opinion um, says that this is analogous to a water-powered machine that does shechita upon an animal. Right? Again, another parallel between matzah and shechita. So the Gemara in Maseches Chullin Daf Tazayin Amud Aleph says that only the koyach rishon, only the first immediate action, is considered to be an action that's performed by a person. That shechita has to be done by a person, so only the first only the first slaughter from pressing the button or doing whatever to getting the machine going would be valid. Anything after that would be invalid because the person's actions are considered too indirect or remote to have the subsequent effect on the fetus to be considered his actions. It's only considered indirectly caused by the person, a brahma, and would be invalid. The lenient argument says that by machine matzah, as long as the process of making the matzah is begun to be lichma, the rest of the process is acceptable. The Chazon Ish says that as long as the process is explicitly begun lishma, the remainder of the process is viewed as stama lishma, sort of like an automatic pilot lishma, and therefore human action would not be a requirement directly. Similarly, wool that's spun by machine using that fitzitzah to make a talus. Many poskim rule leniently that, including the Chazon Ish, that if a Jew has lishma to turn on the machine that spins the wool fitzitzah, the process has begun lishma, and that would apply for the matzah. So there is a controversy about machine Shmurah Matzah. Really, ideally, a person should use handmade Shmurah Matzah. However, there are economic realities at play. There are economic realities at play. Um, what I would suggest as sort of a compromise is, so we said that regular sort of OU matzah, like Manischewitz, that there is shimor from the time of Tchina, that they do supervise the grinding of the wheat. Rav Hershel Schechter paskined that a bracha could be made on that, even if it's only guarded from the time of Tchina. So all machine matzah under the OU supervision is beit Lishma. If a person really had no choice, they could use that for the mitzvahs of the Seder. I don't think we should rely upon that. I think a very good compromise is to use what is sold as machine-made Shmurah Matzah, where there is shimor, where there is guarding from the time of harvesting the wheat, like the Rava's opinion, like the opinion of Rava. It's said that Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal actually would use machine Shmurah Matzah for the Seder. Um, and it's brought from Rav Chaim Jakter that the Rav Zatzal said in Shir at YU that machine-made Shmurah Matzah could certainly be used at the Seder with no compunction. So, I mean, there still is a controversy. I think handmade matzah, to use it for the two Sadarim, would be preferable. Um, but certainly in the debate over whether a machine Shmurah Matzah could be used for the Seder, while there is a dispute um, whether it could be used for those mitzvahs, um, I think given the economic realities this year, that should be a mitigating circumstance. And machine Shmurah Matzah should be viewed as acceptable for the Sadarim. Um, Shalom Mesha Rav Yosef Shal Nathanson Zatzal ruled that it was fine. Um, I think this year we could see that there is perhaps a legitimate need to use this for the Seder. Um, and machine Shmurah Matzah compared to the regular, it certainly is a lot more affordable. I've seen matzah. I've seen, unfortunately, hand matzah this year go for $100, go for as much as $100 a box for 2 pounds. A person could buy Shmurah Matzah in a box, the machine kind, for about $10 a pound. So $10 a pound um, is certainly a lot preferable to 50 a pound. The Hadar brand would be recommended. The Hadar brand of Shmurah Matzah, the box says Shmurah Mishat Kitsira, that it's Shmurah from the time of the harvest, certified under the OU as well as KHA Broyers, $9.39 for a 16-ounce box. So I think given the circumstances economically this year, for those who need it, they could certainly rely on it. Any shilas, any questions, feel free to ask me privately. Um, so I hope that this clarifies some of the issues of what is required for Shmurah Matzah. What does it mean? Why do we have the institution? And everybody should have a Chag Kosher v'Sameach. And I look forward to seeing you all Shabbos. Thank you.